We're on short names. Walter, he put, not Walt. So I apologize. But yeah, I'll go ahead and hit the record. And let's go ahead and let's get started. I think maybe some of the things that, it's great that you started 7 and you still have 7. That's almost unheard of. But that's fantastic. So I can trust everybody can see my screen. If you can't, then, put something in the chat and let me know. But let's go ahead and get started. If you're not familiar with me, my name's Alan White. Been a pastor for over 25 years. My wife and I have been married for 16, going on 17 years in April. We have 4 kids, 2 boys that are 15, 11, a daughter who's 9, and my little boy who is 3. So this year in our family, we have high school, middle school, elementary school, and preschool. So it's quite a gap. I've coached over 1,500 churches in the last 12, 13 years. And since 2011, I've helped churches start over 14,000 groups. What I do, I coach churches individually. I have coaching groups where I have 5 churches at a time that we meet via GoToMeeting like this, only we would have our faces up there like the Brady Bunch. I've developed some online courses. I have a book that you can see there on your screen called Exponential Groups that's going to release on February the 1st. And then I blog over at alanwhite.org. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Alan White, and Facebook. My page is Alan White Consulting. If you're interested on any of those. And that's usually, you can keep up to date on articles and stuff when I'm not just pushing them out through my email. All right, so let's talk about different types of growth. And before I start, I want to just kind of preface this with the fact that I'm not opposed to any kind of growth in groups. I don't like to see groups plateau. I don't like to see groups decline. So when I talk about different strategies, some work better than others. I have a bias there, and you'll hear that bias very clearly. However, I am in favor of all types of growth in any way that it will come. So here's kind of how groups grow in different ways. Some groups grow by addition. Some groups grow by multiplication. We'll get into each of these in a minute. Some groups grow by what we call campaign, and that's what Jeff and I were just discussing. And then some groups or some churches have what I call exponential growth. So let's talk about growth by addition. And a lot of this is based on attitude and focus. So growth by addition says, you look out at the congregation, and this is the auditorium of Brookwood Church that I served here in South Carolina for 4 years. And so you look out at the congregation, and you see your people as being sheep without a shepherd. And so the idea is, in growth by addition, your focus comes to connecting members into groups. And so whether you do that by some sort of affinity, person's age, where they live in the community, that sort of thing, you try to get people connected into groups because they're sheep without a shepherd. And the strategy is that you would handpick small group leaders and kind of pick the best and brightest, and those are the ones that you would move forward with. And you know them really well. You know that they're not going to cause you any problems. And I started off this way, so I can definitely relate. But in this focus, our methodology tends to be some sort of a sign-up card or go on to the church website. And what I've seen in a lot of places is that this creates a problem. It creates a problem administratively, and it creates a problem as far as effectiveness. And the result is that you expend a lot of effort, but you don't see great results. And the reason for that is that you can never recruit enough leaders by yourself. I mean, to get to the size of your church and to accommodate everyone in groups. Now, some people are already connected into Sunday school and midweek Bible study, things like that, other kinds of groups. And that's not the focus of today, but we're not as worried about those folks. But it's hard to recruit this many leaders. And the other thing you find is if somebody signs up on a card, and I'll give you an example. I go to this church in South Carolina that's called New Spring. And so in New Spring, if you want to join a group, you go to the Next Steps area, and on the computer, they have a listing of all of the groups. And so you choose from the listing what group you want to be a part of. You sign up online. And then the procedure is that the leader of the group would contact the prospective member, and then the prospective member would join the group. And that sounds fairly simple. It sounds fairly efficient, only it doesn't work very well. So I have a friend of mine who was the small group pastor down in the Anderson campus, which is the main campus of New Spring. And we asked him, we said, now how many people went online and signed up for groups last week? And he said, well, 52. Okay, now out of that, how many people were contacted by a group leader to be invited to the group? And he said, well, about 27. So now we've cut the number in half. And then the next question was, well, how many of those people who were contacted actually showed up in the group? And the response was, well, we don't know. Now, I love my church, and I've been in conversation with them for the last 2 years about some things that they can change to make it a little bit different. And I'm not going to take credit for the changes that are being made, but I have been part of the conversation. But this is very typical in most churches, because I've handed lists to small group leaders, and they wouldn't pick up the phone and call them. Or they would pick up the phone and call, but then the prospective member would never show up to the group. Or the prospective member would show up and they would do a short-term study together, like a 6-week study, and then they wouldn't see him again. And part of the problem with it was simply that if you just put people into groups, they're not going to instantly connect. They're not necessarily going to become friends. And at the end of it, they just may, want out rather than stay, because maybe they're not committed to groups. They've never been in a group before, you don't know what the dynamics are, that sort of thing. And so I think there are better ways of forming groups that will help them to last longer. We'll get to that in a minute. But this is kind of the mechanics of growth by addition. Your focus is on connecting people into groups. And in order for people to be in groups, then we have to recruit a leader. We have to place those people into groups. And it's a lot of administrative work. And I don't know that we necessarily get the most bang for our buck, if you will. So then let's go to growth by multiplication. And growth by multiplication looks out at the congregation and says, how many people could lead a group? So you're changing your focus from how many people could we get connected into groups to how many people could potentially lead a group. And so the focus is developing group leaders, which I think is great. The strategy that's often used is something that came from a book by my friend Carl George. Wrote a book called Prepare Your Church for the Future back in the early 90s. And the idea was that each group leader would recruit somebody to be their apprentice leader. And then the methodology is that once that apprentice is trained and is ready to go out on their own, then the group would split somehow. We call it multiply, we call it birthing, but hey, we're splitting. And so either the established leader would stay with the group, the apprentice would go out and start a new group, or the apprentice would stay with the group, the established leader would go out and start the group, or the group would just split down the middle and you would form 2 groups. And this was something that we kind of took to heart. I served for 15 years at the church in Northern California, I mentioned earlier, being near Modesto. And our church, when I went there, it was about 300 adults on the weekend. And then our founding pastor, some things were kind of found out. Well, they were found out, and he had to resign. And so our 30 people went down to about 85, and all the staff left except for me. I was trying to leave, but God wouldn't let me. And our new pastor came in the very last Sunday of the year. And so, as we began to build, we built a lot on the purpose-driven model. And our church began to grow, not dramatically, but by about 100 people a year. When I left at the end of 15 years, we had about 1,500 people. Now they're about 3,000, 3,500. They're having to build a new auditorium. So I begin to see, the growth of the church. And, to borrow a line from Rick Warren, he says that a church needs to grow larger and smaller at the same time. And so the idea of growing larger is that we're reaching our community, we're bringing people in. But the idea of smaller was that, you get to a place where you're about 250 people and your congregation starts saying, I don't know everybody anymore. And the reality is everybody doesn't have to know everybody, but everybody needs to know somebody. And then we got to about 400 people and we had to go to 2 services. And then what you hear from the congregation is, I can't find the people that I know. Because, I mean, what we all know is if you change services at your church, you might as well have changed churches because you're not going to see anybody that you saw before. And so I thought, well, we've got to get this going with groups so that we can, catch up to where our growth is and then to keep pace. And so I developed this 5-year plan. And we recruited 10 leaders the first year. We trained the leaders. They all started groups. And so then the next year, the idea was that those 10 leaders would all develop an apprentice who would start new groups the following year. So we'd go from 10 to 20, right? And then I would add a few more. So maybe we'd have 25 the second year, and then we would keep going like that. Now, the reality was my leaders couldn't identify an apprentice. And so because of that, I was still going back and hand-picking a lot of people to lead groups because I couldn't launch enough groups. And so some years we'd start 10 groups, and some years we'd start 6 groups, and one year we started 2 groups, and then another year we started 0 groups. And so we got to the point where we were 7 years into our 5-year plan, and things were not going so well because our group members didn't want to leave the group that they loved. And I've had some discussions with Carl and others about this, and I've decided that maybe this strategy works really well in other countries, but it doesn't work so great in America because people want to stay together. There wasn't much multiplication going on because there weren't apprentices. Nobody wanted to leave their groups. And like I said before, my leaders couldn't identify an apprentice. In fact, I put so much pressure on them because I thought the future of our small group ministry depended on these leaders recruiting an apprentice leader and launching these new groups. And so on Sunday morning, my leaders would pass me in the hallway and they'd look at me and they'd say, "I'm working on my apprentice." And I thought, whatever happened to hello, but I put so much pressure on it that, it got ugly. And then people wanted to stay together. So we were stuck. And I think that's a good image of stuck. We just got stuck, and out of frustration, out of wanting to be effective in launching groups. We had 30% of our adults in groups, so that's nothing to sneeze at. But I knew that we could do better. So we went to what I call growth by campaign, and that idea is that you look at your congregation and you say, well, can I connect 100% or more of our people into groups? And so the idea is, the focus is you want to connect anybody and everybody by any means possible. And the strategy is that you have people self-identify as leaders. So you ask them, would you open up your home? Or you ask them, would you get together with your friends? And for a short-term Bible study, because before I'd say, would you like to lead a group? And the question would be, well, what's the commitment? And my answer would be, well, it's for the rest of your life. Well, that's a little bit long. That's a little bit too much to commit to, whereas the 6-week thing, like what Jeff was describing with 40 days of community, is a little more, within the realm of possibility. So people, you ask them, invite them from the pulpit, typically the senior pastor, and they self-identify as leaders. The methodology is that you want some kind of easy-to-use video-based curriculum. And this does 2 things. For one, it reassures the person who's volunteered to lead the group because they don't have to be the Bible expert. They don't have to be the teacher because the teacher is on the video. The other thing that it does is it reassures the pastor and the staff because you don't want new, inexperienced group leaders teaching in groups. In fact, I don't want group leaders teaching in groups, period. So how do we know they're not teaching heresy? How do we know they're not doing Oprah's book club? How do we know they're not doing something weird? Because they're using the curriculum that we gave them, and we know that it's good teaching because we either chose to purchase the teaching from somebody that we trust, or we made our own, and we know the content's good because it's our content. So you give them something easy to use, and you make it short term so they have kind of a test drive. So this is what we went to in our church in California. Now, this was back in 2004, so it's been a few years ago. And at the time, my pastor was passionate about the Passion of the Christ. He'd already planned a sermon series because he knew once people went to see the film that they would have spiritual questions. So he planned the sermon series, and he had planned some advertising around it. And I went into his office one day. I said, Pastor Dave, I said, what would you think about launching groups based on the Passion of the Christ? And he said, well, I think that's a great idea. Now, if you're an associate pastor and you want to involve small groups in some way or get your pastor more interested, well, instead of trying to persuade your pastor to be more interested in groups, figure out a way to tie groups into what your pastor's interested in. That's a better way to go. And so he thought this was a great idea because he'd already gotten the ball rolling. But I said, here's the thing. I said, I found a study guide that we can use, but we need to make this easy so that anybody could open up their home and invite people in and host the group. And so I said, I found the study, but I said, we need to make a video, and you need to be on the video. So we output these videotapes, and this is crazy to think about now. I used my home video camera. I did the editing on my laptop, and we were 1 week when we output them to VHS tape. And it wasn't Betamax, it was VHS. But and we were 1 week ahead of when the groups needed the videos. And so I had this tape exchange that went on every week in my office. The leaders would bring in last week's tape. I would give them this week's tape. Then I would take last week's tape to the duplicator, and it would become next week's tape. And we did this for 6 weeks in a row, and it was a lot of work. But here's what happened. When my pastor stood up on a Sunday morning, and he said, we've prepared these materials for you for the Passion of the Christ series. And he said, if you would be interested in opening up your home, we'll help you get your group started. And we doubled our groups in 1 day. Now, bear in mind, it had taken 7 years to get to the place where we were, and we doubled our groups in a day. So the result was, often with a campaign, is that you have a lot of excitement for 6 weeks, and then after the 6 weeks, the bottom falls out. Now, Jeff, you already said that you've kept all your groups, so that's you've done better than most. But the other thing with a campaign is it gives you potential for what I call exponential. We'll get into that in just a minute. The reason is that a lot of times it falls off after 6 weeks is that there's no plan for what comes next. And this is what happened for a lot of churches, including ours, when we did 40 Days of Purpose. You start groups for 40 Days of Purpose. It's the end of 40 days, and there's nothing to go to next. And the assumption was the group was for 6 weeks because that's what we invited them to do. The other thing that happens is, when you recruit anybody and everybody to host a group, your growth completely overwhelms your coaching structure. It's hard to keep up with all of these folks. So these are some things that we had to work on, of how to give them a next step so that they would go from one series to the next, how to recruit my experienced leaders so that they would begin to coach new leaders. And we actually got to a place within 6 months where we had 125% of our average adult attendance in groups. Now, that's not funny pastor math. Part of it is that not everybody attends every Sunday, but they will go to their group. And so that was kind of in the favor numbers-wise. But we also had groups that, they met in break rooms at work. They met in coffee shops. One group met on a commuter train that went from Stockton, California to San Jose every Tuesday morning. They took up an entire section of a train, and they had their Bible study. So this is what we learned from campaigns. But then after, doing this myself and beginning to coach churches, we began to look at things differently. And so this is the idea of getting into what I call exponential growth. And the question or the focus that produces exponential growth is when you look out at your congregation and you ask yourself, is this an audience or is this an army? Because if this is an audience, well, an audience needs to be entertained. An audience needs to be catered to. An audience needs to have things provided for them. And there have been a lot of great churches that have led a lot of people to Christ using what I described. But I'm wondering if we're not getting as far as we could. Because what if we looked out and instead of seeing an audience, we saw an army? And an army is a little different. An army, you train and you equip them. An army, you empower them, that they go out and do the work of the ministry, just like we read in Ephesians 4. So we're not there just to feed and to care for them like we would an audience. We're there to equip and empower them so that they're going to go out and reach their community, starting with the people that they already know. So the focus is that every member can gather a group. Now, this may start seeming a little bit crazy, but it's not as crazy as it seems. And I'll give you some examples in a few minutes. The strategy is to give people permission and opportunity. Who do you know that might be interested in doing a Bible study with you on a felt needs topic? You can gather your friends and do a study. You can gather your family members and do a study. You can gather your coworkers and do a study. And it doesn't necessarily have to be official, but I'm still going to provide the curriculum for them. I'm still going to provide them with a coach and some training. And so the methodology is, it's easy to use curriculum, it's basic training, and it's the support of a coach, even, and it may not be an official coach, and maybe an experienced leader that takes one of these new ones under their wings and walks alongside them. Now, the cool thing about this is that when we advertise groups, we have to know leaders very, very well, or else we get ourselves into trouble. But when we say, go and gather your friends and do a study, and they're gathering with people that they already know, and we don't advertise their group, then there's a little more grace and flexibility in that. The result is the people are connected both inside and outside of the church. We had groups that the only person who attended our church was the person who led the group or hosted the group. And the people that they invited were people that they knew in the community, people that they worked with, people that they commuted with in the one case. But they were the only person who attended our church, but the people that they were connected with were outside of the church. Some groups were mixed, some groups were just people that were in the church. But what I found was that if they already had a relationship, then the groups tended to last longer than just, oh, here's a sign-up card, and this pile all wants to meet on Tuesday nights, so they can be a group, or this pile all lives in the same zip code, so they can be a group. Well, this was people were already connected to each other. And so here we were just giving them a Bible study and encouraging them to do something intentional about their spiritual growth. And so the reason that this worked was, first of all, we leveraged existing relationships, just like I said. I had one church in Hawaii that almost their entire church was connected into groups, and almost all of those groups, because the church is made up of native Hawaiians, almost all of those groups were families. But then they got into this dilemma of, how do we get them to branch out? How do we get them to go beyond the comfort of their family? And I said, well, just ask them to expand their family circle and invite a couple of people that are not, include them in the family. Because, among Hawaiians, the joke is everybody in Hawaii is cousins anyway. So just invite a few cousins to come into your family. The other thing is to give people permission to start a group on their terms. So, and this is not to say that they're renegade or they're rogue or they're going to do something against the church or whatever. They're still going to give them a coach. We're still giving them the studies. But the idea is to offer the flexibility of where they meet and when they meet and how they meet and some of those kinds of things. For instance, I had one church in Middle Georgia that a woman came up to the pastors one Sunday after the congregation had been invited to go and do the study with their friends. And she had tears in her eyes and she says, I feel like for the first time I can be part of a small group here. And the story was that she had two boys with autism. And I have a son with Asperger's, so I have an understanding of this. And she was always afraid to join a group because if in the middle of the group, one of her boys had kind of an autistic meltdown, which happens in our family, then, it would cause a lot of confusion. It would disturb the group. She would be embarrassed. There was some problems. And then if she hosted the group in her home, she felt it was an equal problem because then people that didn't know them very well that came or were assigned to the group, we might have the same circumstance. But she says, Now what I understand is I can get the Bible study and I can gather people who already know us. And if my boys have a problem during the meeting, they're going to understand. My friends are going to understand because they know us, and this is not going to be a surprise to them. And she says, for the very first time in my being part of this church, I feel like I can be in a small group. And we don't always think about, those kinds of circumstances. Or what about people who are introverted? Say lead a group and, anybody that wants to could sign up for your group. Well, some people have never met a stranger. But if you're introverted and the idea of having 12 people that you don't know coming to your house every week for a Bible study, it could be anywhere from intimidating to terrifying. But introverts are not friendless. They probably have, 5 or 6 very good friends that they want to do the study with if they can determine that that group of people is who they do the Bible study with. And I'm not saying that our goal in life should make this comfortable for everybody, but I think it's easier to start things from a place where people are comfortable. And then maybe among that group of friends, friends of friends are invited and some things like that. We get them out of their comfort zone a little bit, but if they're completely uncomfortable, they're probably not going to do it. So anyway, we've seen a lot of this happen with exponential growth to the point that, some churches have double the number of people in small groups that they currently have in their weekend service. And that's not as exponential as I would like to go, but it's pretty cool that those sorts of things are happening. One pastor recruited 30% of his congregation on a Sunday morning to lead groups, to do a study with their friends. All right, so let's talk about how you get there. So 4 keys to an exponential group launch. Number 1, is your senior pastor all in? And if you're not the senior pastor, sometimes the excuses we make for ourselves are things like this. I would love that, but my senior pastor doesn't talk about groups. My senior pastor is not in a group. My senior pastor doesn't preach about community. My senior pastor sees groups as one of many options. And yeah, I would love to have that, but it's never, ever going to happen. So the first thing you want to do is you want to put your pastor's teaching on the curriculum. And your pastor will become more interested in groups. Now, this is Chip Ingram, and I did a series with his church a couple years ago now called Holy Ambition. And Chip was on the curriculum, and he'd written the book, and so we created the Bible study to go along with it, as well as the videos. And Chip's church is about 2,200 people on the weekend, and for that fall, it was the fall of 2015, we recruited 500 people to lead groups. They had about 120 groups prior to that, and they had 400 in this series. Last year, they had 500 in their fall series. Make sure I get my numbers correct. But what happens is that when your pastor's on the video, the church members are going to be more interested in the curriculum, partly because if they're not connected to each other, the reason that they're at church other than Jesus himself is because of your senior pastor. They like his personality, they like his teaching, they like his style. And so when the pastor stands up and says, we've prepared these materials for you based on my teaching, well, then you're just giving your people more of what they already want. The other thing that happens is that that when the pastor's on the curriculum and has made that investment, the pastor is very interested in making sure that there are group leaders and there are people connected into groups, because if the pastor's taking time to create curriculum, we don't want the curriculum to fail. So I had a church, we'll talk about it a little bit more later, down in the Tampa area, and we spent a whole day, coaching their team. They shot their own video, and you don't have to spend tens of thousands of dollars. I've got one church that shoots their curriculum on an iPhone, and it works out great. And so this church in Tampa, we spent a whole day shooting video. The next morning, the pastor pulls us into his office, and he says, now we've filmed this video, we're creating this curriculum. Now, how do we recruit leaders? How do we get people connected into groups? And their discipleship pastor came to me later in the day, and he said, I've been trying to get my pastor interested in groups for 2 years. He said, and you just did it. I mean, almost like it was an accusation. I just smiled at him and said, well, I'm Alan White. No, that is not what I said. The reality was the pastor was interested in recruiting leaders and connecting people into groups because he had made the investment of putting his teaching on the video. And what I found in my experience, even just the last 5 or 6 years, I've worked a number of years for Brett Eastman at Life Together, is that people are more interested in their own pastor's teaching than they are even of some nationally known speakers. And you don't even have to have the quality, at that level. You can, it's possible. The other thing you want to do to involve your senior pastors, you want to find a small group solution for your senior pastors' every issue. So studies have shown that people in groups, they give more, they serve more, they attend more often. I mean, all of these great things. And I'm not just making stuff up. I mean, look at Ed Stetzer's book, Transformational Groups. Years ago, there's a Princeton professor named Robert Wuthnow who wrote a book called Sharing the Journey. And both of these they're not anecdotal. They're based on research. And both of them show these exact things that I'm talking about. That groups meet an assimilation need, a spiritual growth need, an outreach need, a giving need, a serving need. And the percentages are really astonishing as far as people that are in groups and people that are not groups. And also, if your senior pastor is not on the webinar, then share the recording with them. Or I'm going to do this again next Tuesday and invite your pastor to sign up and be on the webinar. And hopefully I can convince them. All right, first key is your senior pastoral. And second key is your topic relevant? Now, I worked with churches developing video curriculum for several years now. And we've had some topics that weren't so good. Like one church said they started every year with a 21-day fast, and they're doing their 21-day fast right now. It's a friend of mine in New York City, and it's a great church. But fasting is a very mature sort of topic. I said, it's going to be a little challenging recruiting people to groups for a fasting curriculum. But the good news is that the refreshments are going to be very, very easy. But, other things like anything to do with money, tithing, budgeting, giving, generosity, very difficult topics, or capital campaign, very difficult topics to start groups, because I don't know that you really want to make the association between groups and giving, or groups and a capital campaign, because the next time you talk about groups, people are going to go, oh, how much money do they want this time? Or one church wanted to do a curriculum on evangelism, teaching people how to do evangelism. Like, good grief, what's your next series going to be? Public speaking, death, taxes. And so what we actually did was, instead of making the curriculum about evangelism, and I have nothing against evangelism, it's just hard to start groups with that topic. I said, instead of making the curriculum about how to do evangelism, what if we made the curriculum evangelistic? And so what we did was we created a curriculum based on the felt needs and issues in their community that a lot of people could connect with, because they have these felt needs and issues. And in the course of the curriculum, we gave them testimonies of people that were brought from death to life. We gave them the message of the gospel, so that the curriculum itself was the evangelism tool. We didn't tell them that starting in, but introduced people to the gospel, and they came to faith because they went through the curriculum with a group of their friends. So we accomplished similar things. We just took a little different approach. Now, some curriculums have been great topics. Obviously, Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life is kind of the granddaddy of them all. But other things, like Carrie Shook did one called 1 Month to Live. Gene Apple did a curriculum called Hope Rising a few years ago, gave a copy out to every person that attended Easter. This was back in 2012, I think. And there were about 7,000 people at the time, his church in Anaheim. They started 460 groups off of Easter Sunday. Pastor in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, did a curriculum called Monsters Under the Bed about, kind of fears, what people are afraid of, what they dread, and how to overcome fears. Church in Warner Robins, Georgia, did one called Hand-Me-Downs on leaving a legacy. Church in the Indianapolis area, the series called Family Matters. The title's a little dated, but what we did with this one was we took 6 messages that the pastor had preached on marriage, family, being single, relationships in general, and we took those sermons, we edited them down to a 10-minute script, gave it back to the pastor. He approved it, changed it to make sure it still sounded like him, and then put it up in the teleprompter. So you take messages that have been in files that have been sitting around, that the sermon was preached and now it's collecting dust, and you can take those and kind of breathe new life into them and create curriculums. You don't have to come up with something brand new. You don't have to come up with the next purpose-driven life. But again, the idea of topics that people are going to be interested in, this is where you need to start as you're getting people interested in groups. And then as those groups go, then you can get to the more mature topics. So I'm not saying avoid the more mature topics. I'm just saying let's phase some things in. Let's create a sequence of curriculum so that we know when to do felt need when we're forming groups, and then when to do other topics, as they need them. The third key is, how's your coaching structure? Everybody feels terrible about the coaching structure. I don't have any coaches, all of that sort of thing. And that's fine. Most churches don't do very well with the coaching structure, or they don't like their coaching structure. But let me tell you this. It is mission critical from when somebody says, yes, I want to lead a group, until that group starts. It is mission critical to have an experienced leader assigned to that person that they've been introduced to, that will pick up the phone and give them a call every week to encourage them, to pray for them, to check in on them, to help them, because there are so many ways that those leaders can be discouraged. For instance, let's say this guy invites some friends over to the barbecue, and in case you're wondering, those are root beers in their hands. But anyway, invites them over to a barbecue. He's going to invite these folks to join his small group. And somebody said, oh, we already joined, another group. So sorry, man, we can't be in your group. And then somebody else says, oh, it's Tuesday night. We can't do Tuesday night because we got something else going on. And the other guy says, sorry, dude, I'm not really even your friend. I'm just here for the burgers. And they're looking really awesome. Well, obviously, this guy that's trying to start the group is going to become very discouraged. And so if he's left on his own, he's going to feel like, this was a dumb idea. Nobody wants to be in my group. Why did I ever think that I could do this? Why did I ever think that God could use me this way? This was a mistake. Forget it. And then it ends right there. But if he has an experienced leader that calls him up and says, how's it going? Well, I have these people over for a barbecue. I invited them to the group. They either couldn't do it, or they weren't interested. And I think I made a mistake. And an experienced leader says, you're not the only one that's ever happened to. Not everybody that I've invited has been interested in joining a group. So let's pray. You had an idea of what your group should be like. Let's pray about who God would bring to your group. And encourage that guy so that he'll go another week. I had this happen with a couple in our church in California. They had invited 20 people to their group, and all 20 had said no. And which I was shocked. I kept a straight face, but I was shocked. And I asked them on Sunday morning, how's it going? Because they had actually left a group to start a group back when I was doing that thing. And I said, well, it's not going very well. We think we made a mistake. We think we should have stayed in our group because we invited 20 people and they all said no. And I said, we really don't understand because, we shower, we clean our house, we don't understand. And I said, well, you guys had an idea of how your group, would form. I said, let's pray and ask God about what his idea is of who should be in your group. They called me a week later and they said, Pastor Allen, would you stop sending people to our group because we got 14 people. We're going to have a living room full. We're going to have the kids in the basement. And so please stop sending people to our group because we are not going to have room. Now, how many people had I sent to the group? I sent exactly 0 people to their group. We prayed and God sent 14 people to their group. And now the key was, it wasn't significant that I had the conversation with them that day. What was significant was that someone had the conversation with them that day. And so this is where I would encourage you to tap the shoulders of some of your established leaders, some of your mature people in your church, and say, would you walk alongside a new leader from when they say yes to the end of a study? And encourage them because they might face some setbacks. Pray for them when you think about them. Answer their questions. If the questions are, the question is more than what you feel like you can comfortably answer, then, come to the staff, come to the pastors and talk about that. But I have seen, leaders honored that I would ask them to follow up after a new one. But I've also seen much better coaching, especially, from back in the day when I was trying to coach all the leaders myself. That was a disaster. All right, key number 4 is what's the next step. So if you're launching a curriculum, don't just be thinking about the curriculum that's going to launch in a couple weeks. Think about what those groups are going to be doing once that series ends. And so, like I said, do a 40-day campaign. At day 41, the thing falls off a cliff. But if you offer them a next step, and in the middle of the study, I would say, oh, by the way, if you guys enjoy meeting together, I'm going to offer another study for you to go into next. I usually don't give them choices because new groups tend to not have much of an opinion. But the decision I want them to make before the end of the first study, I want them to decide whether or not they're going to move forward into the next study. And that strategy by itself should help at least 80% of your new groups continue. And I found this to be very, very effective. Even groups that started after Easter. And in the first week of May, I said to them, oh, by the way, our next church-wide study is going to be the second week in October. So keep that in mind. Do some fun things with your group this summer. Do some things socially. Serve together. And then in September, we'll start talking about what's going to happen in the fall. And when we got to September, 80% of the groups that started after Easter were right there ready to continue into that fall series. And I tell you what, I would not have believed that except that I actually experienced it myself. And I'm not making up stories. That was the real deal. All right, let me tell you about a couple of churches that I worked with. This was the church I mentioned earlier about getting the pastor interested in groups. The Van Dyke Church is a church of about 1,800 adults, or it was in 2011 when I first met them. They had 400 people in groups, so about 30%. We produced curriculum, coached their team. Their team did the work. We added some strategies of how to recruit leaders. And in their first run, they went from 400 people in groups to 1,000 people in groups. We added 600 people into groups. Their second curriculum they did in New Year of 2012, and they went from 1,000 people in groups to 1,600 people in groups. Then they did a third one. Again, they're pastors on all of this. I know it sounds like a lot of work, but this was the first year and only the first year. They did a third series that launched after Easter, and they got to a point where they had over 2,000 people in groups in a church of 1,800. So here's the cool thing. The pastor's name is Matthew Hartsfield. He's a great guy. He's been at this church for over 20 years. And I interviewed him on a live webinar a couple months ago. And so now 5 years after started working with them, they have about 2,300 adults on the weekend, and they are maintaining 80 to 90% of their adults in groups. And they're still producing their own curriculum, not 3 times a year, but on occasion. This is Father Charlie Holt. He's pastor of St. Peter's Episcopal Church in the Orlando, Florida area. I met Father Charlie about 12 years ago when they were doing 40 Days of Purpose. His congregation's 260 people. And for 40 Days of Purpose, they started 75 groups. So his congregation went out. They invited their neighbors to do a study. They effectively had 750 people in a Bible study, which is 3 times the number of people they had attending their church, and which is just incredible. Since then, he's created his own 3-part series based on Lent, Easter, and Pentecost that over 100 churches have participated in, all different denominations, and churches much larger than his. So it's been pretty incredible. This is Pastor Troy Jones. He's at New Life Center, the Great Assemblies of God Church in Renton, Washington. New Life is a church of 2,500 adults. When I started working with them, this would have been this early in 2015. They had 100 groups. We produced curriculum with them, and we added some strategies of how to get people connected. 6 months later, they did 2 series. They did one in the New Year. They did one after Easter. They went from 100 groups to 500 groups in a church of 2,500. Now, this church is in Renton, Washington, which is not the buckle of the Bible Belt. But they saw the potential if people invited their friends, their neighbors, their coworkers to their home to do a Bible study. They had so many people connected into groups but it never darkened the door of their church, and yet they were being introduced to Pastor Troy through the teaching video that was being shown in the homes every week. So then when they came to church, they felt like they already knew him. And so he made it his goal that they would actually have 1,000 groups in their church. And the reason was he saw the evangelistic impact of having people invite people that they know to come and be a part of their groups. So I'm going to take just a few minutes, and then we're going to have some questions at the end. But just a few minutes just to talk to you about maybe how I can help your church. I'm starting a coaching group. The first meeting is actually today. So if you act really, really quick, you can get in on the first meeting. Otherwise, I have one spot left in this group. And so in the coaching group, this is what we do. We talk about the current needs in your church's small group ministry. So even though it's a group, we still talk about individual focus on each church. How to engage your senior pastor in groups, effective recruiting strategies, sustaining groups through coaching and training, the latest trends in developing curriculum, how to produce your own curriculum, effectively tracking your groups, and what to measure. Building groups while wearing many hats, creating a small group team, because even if you have staff, it's going to end up being more work than any church can afford to hire staff. So it's important to have a volunteer team that's going to work with the staff in order to manage the small group system. So what's included in the group would be goal setting and strategic planning, specifically for your church as well as the other churches in the group. Some executable timelines and support to achieve your goals. So we would actually talk about a campaign and what do you need to do, from week to week building up to that campaign. We would have regular teleconferences, and it's not like this. It's not, me talking the whole time. I usually give a little bit of preparation, which could be watch a video or read a chapter from my book or something like that. And then we get together on the call and discuss it. And I limit the groups to 5 churches because GoToMeeting has a threshold where you can only have 6 cameras on at a time. And so one camera is mine and the other 5 each, one to each of the 5 churches. Also, we have a private Facebook group. So in between meetings, we need to interact, ask a question, answer a question, give a testimony of what's happened. We do that in our Facebook group. You have lifetime access to the recordings of the group. We give you tools, samples, intellectual property. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You have something that you can start with. You'd also receive a copy of my book. And like I said, the group is actually starting today at 3 o'clock Eastern. So how much does it cost? Well, when I work with churches individually, and I don't work with a lot of churches this way. I did this with Chip Ingram's church. I'm currently working with Mariners Church out in Irvine, California. But when I work with churches individually, they pay me between $1,000 and $3,000 per month for 12 months. And so in this, what I'm doing with the coaching is you only pay what you need. And so the first option is you would do the 12 group sessions over the 6 months, so 2 a month. You have lifetime access to 2 online courses. One is called Leading an Exponential Group Launch. The other is called Coaching Exponential Groups. That one's in development. And then the templates, the tools, the timelines that I mentioned. And so to do option 1 is about $1,500. Option 2 is the same as option 1, and we would add a monthly one-on-one meeting for the 6 months. And so that option is, just shy of $2,000. And then the third option is all of the above. Plus, I would come out and spend a day with your team. We would send out some surveys, collect some data. I would spend a day with your team. And that option is $3,000 plus, whatever travel expenses to get out to your place. So again, 3 options. First is just the coaching group. The other is the coaching group and the one-on-ones. And then the third is the coaching group, the one-on-ones, and the assessment. So if any of that's of interest to you, and I don't say this like as a pressure thing, but what I'm going to do is I want to fill up the group that I have going now. I have 4 churches, one in Colorado, one in Kansas, one in Michigan, one in Texas. And I like to, fill that spot, and I'll fill it within the next 30 days is my goal. After 30 days, if I don't fill the spot, then we'll just proceed with 4 because by then we're far enough into it, we don't want to go backward. And so here's the deal: is if you get into it in the first 30 days, you say, hey, this is not really what I was expecting. This is not what I really need. Then I'll give you all your money back. And then the additional bonus is if you decide to sign up in the next 7 days, then what I'll do is, regardless of what package you would sign up for, I would give you 2 additional one-on-one consultations. And so that's on top. So if you do the basic one, the option one, then it would have 2. If you do the other one, it would have 8. And you guys can do the math on that. All right, so let's talk. If you're interested, you can contact me. My email is alan@alanwhite.org. I'm not a narcissist. It's just I'm not very creative. And then, or you can call me on my cell, and the cell number's there. If you're interested in that, then let's talk a little bit further. But what I want to do now is open this up for questions. And so I'm going to unmute everybody. So if you have a microphone, you can speak up. Otherwise, you can talk in the chat window there. So here I am, live and in person again. And I was before too. But anyway, and I see Pam's joined us. Welcome, Pam. Glad to have you with us. Pam is from the great state of Maine. So anybody that's cold today, go complain to Pam. All right. So thoughts, questions, either use the chat window or about anything I talked about. It doesn't have to be about the coaching group. But anything I talked about today, if you look at some of these things and go, wow, how in the world would that work in my church? Let's just spend a few minutes talking about it. I've got about 10 minutes till I need to go into my next thing. But let's go ahead and have a conversation. All right. Jeff says, thank you. Great material. Okay. The recording will be available. What I'll do is it records my voice and the slides, which I apologize. My voice kind of gave out midway. But I'll put it up on YouTube, and I'll send you the link